Adopting a headless front end, challenges, trade-offs, and benefits with Amplience founder and CEO James Brooke and Mobify VP Product Drew Lau. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to James.
Thank you very much, Ash. Drew, how you doing?
I'm good, excited to be on here.
Fantastic. So it's great to be on the call. Fantastic to be partnering with you guys. We've been talking about this for a while, haven't we? So I think the official announcement of our partnership went out a few days ago.
Yeah, this is the party for it, I guess. So yes.
Excellent. All right, well, let's have some fun with it then. So what have we got for you today, folks? Well, in terms of agenda, I'm going to spend a little bit of time up front talking about how headlessness and headless architecture and all these concepts and ideas are really helping to drive significant advantages for our customers in terms of agility. We'll talk broadly about that. I'm going to hand over at that point to Drew, who's going to pick up on a number of pieces around the actual front end itself, and we've got a couple of discussion points along the way, and then we'll finish with a bit of kind of build or buy type discussion, right, Drew? Cool. Okay, so let me crack in. I think first of all, I'm just going to introduce Amplience. And I think the best place to start is to explain a little bit about our purpose and our mission. And what we really care about at Amplience is helping our customers to tell more powerful stories. What do we mean by powerful stories? Well, we mean stories that really engage your consumer. So stories that these days are increasingly personalized, are really rich in terms of content, are really consistently delivered across multiple touch points, and that really sort of get to the point where consumers are engaged in a much deeper and frankly more valuable relationship with you. But this kind of powerful storytelling is something that we do at very large scale indeed. So when we say storytelling at scale, you can see there on the right hand side where there's a little graph. That's a view of traffic off our platform over the last year, and you can see towards the right of that graph at the end of last year was a big peak around Black Friday, and I think we served some incredible amount of content objects off the Amplience platform, 1.4 trillion, a huge amount of content and data. I think I can't actually remember the precise stat, but 800 years of HD video or something like that worth of content. And of course, a lot of that content these days is mobile. That's being delivered out to 300 plus high volume commerce brands who are driving all the content in their experiences. It's equivalent to about 700 million visits per month worth of traffic. And the Amplience platform is 100% cloud and SaaS, microservices, API first, and headless. And we're doing that for lots of amazing brands. I think in particular, ones that I'd call out today, Crate & Barrel, amazing experience building out all of the headless content for them and really kind of making that whole experience a far more agile one. We're working with amazing fast fashion retailers in the UK like Boohoo, fantastic luxury brands like Tom Ford, and we've actually just gone live with Tumi on a product configurator, so you can actually get on and customize a backpack from there, which is a classic headless content use case. But we'll come back to some of that stuff a little bit later. So let me flip on. The other thing that I thought would just be worth mentioning at the beginning is we did get recognized by Forrester in their web content management report a little bit later in the year last year. And you can see us there. It's our first year in that, and we were very delighted to be in there as a strong performer. Forrester in particular pulled out a couple of things that I thought were interesting, particularly with regards to headless, because quite often headlessness is associated with developer tools and not necessarily with practitioner tools. But we have this fantastic, beautiful content planning and collaboration workflow, which really helps to drive productivity. And as we like to say, absolutely simplify the content management problem, soup to nuts. So that's enough about Amplience. Drew, I'm going to ask you to do the introductions for Mobify, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. So Mobify has been around for, I think, about the same amount of time as Amplience. We've mainly been known for and focused on the mobile side of the equation. So in the past, you may have run into us around MDOT and responsive technologies, adaptive technologies, and recently progressive web apps, working closely with various teams like the Google and Microsoft teams and so on. But recently, we've been looking at pushing forward what we call front end of the service, which fits really nicely into the headless content and commerce discussion. Essentially, we want to be the head to any headless commerce and content system. And we're doing that by leading with applying things like progressive web apps to that model, of which we built a lot of the enterprise implementation of that one over the last 2 years, including sites like Lancome and Debenhams in the UK. And we do that with a variety of joint partners, including Amplience and a bunch of our friendly kind of system integrators. Over the last year, we've driven over $1 billion US dollars of gross merchandise value via our front end of the service, projecting to double that in 2019. So you can see that we're starting to see a growing trend in amount of revenue flowing through headless systems, and in our case through the head of that. So we're excited to work closer with all our partners like Amplience on pushing this new way of looking at a modern commerce architecture forward.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think it's really exciting as we both move into this new world of headlessness. There are opportunities opening up all over the place, and in particular to really help our customers sort of unlock what I would call real business agility. So I thought what we'd do is spend a little bit of time sort of defining the problem and sort of kicking off the presentation by just sort of trying to understand really what headlessness is all about, why you should care, I think, most importantly. One of my favorite quotes is this one by Jack Welch, obviously infamously CEO of GE back in the glory days. And he says, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Well, I think for those of us that have lived in this industry for a little while, and particularly for you retailers out there and brands that are dealing with consumers directly, and increasingly B2B folks that are sort of changing the way in which their order management and everything else works, the only thing that is a constant in our world is change. It's not just change in the customer experience, it's change in the technology, it's change in every aspect of the way in which we really reach out and engage with our customers. And I think, and this is my own perspective, that this really gets to the heart of why headlessness is so attractive and interesting. Obviously, everything really started back in 2007 with the iPhone. Back then, before then, it was really Internet Explorer plus some technologies like Flash that would enable you to create a digital experience. So it was a very narrow, very specific channel that only really worked on desktops. And there really wasn't too much complexity to think about. Lots of content management systems that I spent the early part of my career working with, and the e-commerce platforms that accompanied them, were really built for an era before the iPhone. They were built in the days of, Web 2.0 and Java-based MVC and all the rest of it. And of course, the iPhone absolutely transformed the way in which consumers interact with brands. So our CTO, John Williams, has been writing some excellent blog content of late, and I've lifted some of his quite amusing analogies and diagrams from his blogs, and we'll send you some links on those later. And John talks very much about the challenge that this poses to the traditional monoliths. So as he puts here, the ancient platform silos, all of these cyclops that are set up here. Web CMS was really designed for website management. It was pretty much a sort of standalone tool that would manage that website content. It would do templates, it would do navigation, taxonomy, and a few other bits and pieces. The e-commerce platform wouldn't really be integrated back in the day, so it would sit alongside that. It would run the store. Search would be a part of that experience, and then along came this concept called digital experience platform, which would kind of roll all this stuff up into a single coherent platform with testing and analytics and all these other things. And in reality, I think that's actually been very hard vision to achieve, because all of those separate components are difficult to integrate, and it's kind of hard to build a coherent whole. But there are lots and lots of silos, and I think everyone recognizes this view. But the reality of today's customer experience is that actually there are a huge number of digital channels, when you start to think about it, that you really need to drive the experience from. Some of them are commerce enabled, some of them are content enabled, some of them are both. Some of them are internal to your own organization. They could be part of the warehousing and reverse logistics process. They could be part of the internal studio process. They could be about managing affiliates and other marketplaces. It could be about building mobile web and app experiences to deliver the e-commerce storefront. You name it. There are, a huge number of places that content and customer experience needs to live. And it's the analogy John uses in his blog, which I think is quite apt, is that of the Hydra. And if you remember the Hydra from your classical education, once you chop the head off one of the Hydra serpents, I think a couple of them grow back almost immediately. And that's kind of how it feels when you start really digging into where content needs to live and where commerce needs to appear. And of course, your monolithic Cyclops, doesn't really do a very good job of accommodating all these channels. You can bend it and twist it out of shape to try and accommodate some of these different use cases, but reality is it's quite hard to do. And and by the sort of Hydra analogy, I think this is quite neatly illustrated here. Alexa has made a big impact. There are lots of applications and extensions to Alexa that you can install that provide a voice interface to all sorts of different services. That's really a headless content interface. And if you want to start ordering through those kind of interfaces, you're going to need a headless sort of content management type application. So that's all very well, and that's just content as data. But then, of course, if you combine that, let's say, in a car, and here's one of our partner diagrams, commerce tools, where they're trying to bring a kind of Internet of Things into the car environment, maybe provide a voice-like interface. Well, then you also have to provide a kind of visual interface as well simultaneously. So rather than this being a single new UX challenge, it actually has turned into two new UX challenges, because now you've got to deliver content simultaneously into a screen, using a really great front-end application like Mobify, but you might also then deliver it into a voice-based interface as well. So the Hydra is real, and the more you dig into the real use cases that exist around all of these things, the more you see that this sort of multiplication problem continues unabated. And of course, that means that our Hydra is really eating our Cyclops for breakfast, and they're really struggling, these monolithic applications, to deal with this complexity, and particularly to respond in a really agile way. Why is that? Well, if for any of those of you who have been in this industry for some time, you will recognize a bit of scripting when you see it. So this is, I think, a JSP actually that we pulled from somewhere just for illustration purposes. It could be, could equally be an ASP, it could be ISML, it could be any of these languages that are really used by e-commerce platforms and content management platforms to bind together the user experience itself with the functional elements in the application layer and the data that we really need to create a complete customer experience. The problem with these things is that they are extremely complex. They're hard to manage, difficult to maintain. For a lot of our customers, constitute a complete design and build cycle, and therefore, are inflexible, really hard to change. So when you look at the environment from a monolith perspective, what you normally see is a CMS, there's some ERP, a bit of CRM platform, and some e-commerce. And it's all wired together in a really complex way. Back in the day when John Williams, our CTO, and I were at Publicis, LBI, Sapient, all these different places, we used to sell a lot of the implementation services around this. And of course, the more complex the stack, the more money we made. And back in the day, we thought this was a very good thing. Having talked to customers about this from their perspective, what we're seeing is that this complexity, and in particular, the number of skills you need to just complete a single piece of development, is really hampering the ability to get anything done. It results in very high total cost of ownership and some very poor agility. What tends to happen is the customer experience domain itself is sort of defined from the CMS and the e-commerce, but because they overlap, what you end up with is an even more complex picture. And in the end, actually, a pretty disjointed customer experience, and one that really doesn't flex very well for all these new use cases. So with the monolith, you get lots of UX control, but a spaghettified set of increasingly complex systems that sort of unpick and to manage. Change becomes almost impossible reasonably quickly, and things tend to grind to a halt. To extend that pastor analogy a little bit further, Ideally, what you'd like is a little bit more consistency at the front end, and things packaged in a much neater and more manageable way, and yet still retaining the flexibility that you need to create really sophisticated experiences. So in a world of numerous front ends, it's all about trying to make sure that the storytelling works at every single touch point, and that it's a really consistent experience. And if it's commerce enabled, that it's that it retains your basket, that it knows who you are, that it provides the right sort of contextual service for what you're doing, and does so sympathetically with where you are in the journey. So these things are key in terms of how the user experience needs to evolve. What can we do about it? Well, if you're stuck with one of these complicated, integrated, monolithic architectures, the reality of the world is that you can sort of start to decouple the back end from the front end. So going headless is really all about simplifying the world by, just where that join is between single page apps and progressive web apps and native apps and microservices, beginning to define that as a set of APIs, and ideally to define everything as a set of APIs that you can really simply and easily get access to, and start to build a much more agile and sophisticated architecture. Good example of this stuff, and I thought we'd call in another partner here, so Elastic Path, who do a great job on the headless commerce side. I really like this example. So I think this is Carnival Cruises. You get a medallion when you get on the cruise. You don't have to take any cash with you to pay for anything when you're on the cruise, and of course it unlocks your door, gives you access to the different places that you may have booked during your stay, and again, integrates with an app. So of course you've got content in an app which is visual. It requires sort of some screen flow and logic, the kind of thing that you would use Mobify to really help simplify. And then you have something which isn't an app, it's just a way of sort of performing a transaction using some RFID and other technology. And of course, what that enables you to do is seamlessly get in and out of your own apartment, but of course buy things as well, so you don't have to worry about that. So the sort of headlessness of the experience actually completely changes the customer experience in this particular example, and I think therefore really works to illustrate just how sophisticated we can start to become with the customer experience if we start to use this much more decoupled way of thinking about the world, so that the application logic isn't wired in to the front end itself. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to you, Drew.
James, I love how we both end up using spaghetti type slides and pasta-based analogies all the time. This is our spaghetti slide. Just to pick up where you left off around what we tend to see is just as you just layer in more and more front-end systems and back-end systems together, typically we just see like a set of slowdowns and complexity. Just we see so many customers just like, I'm so slow now because there's so many things to deal with, and I can't just get my changes out there because it takes several weeks to put together what should be a fairly simple feature. So that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to start pivoting towards our first topic of around agility, and where we're working with Amplience and other partner teams about is looking at a bit of a new architecture. And what does headless architecture actually mean in this case? If we combine content and commerce, what we're trying to advocate for is putting the CMS, the content platform, right beside the commerce platform, so they're at the same level, as opposed to in the past where we funneled one through the other. In this case, we're looking actively at making sure they're sitting side by side. You can do this as this is now a set of microservices all lined up and not being put through each other, but projected to the various front-end experiences. And that lets us really activate the full value of the content and commerce systems, which is a bit of different than the approach we've seen in the last, probably 4 or 5 years when we're trying to integrate these different systems together. We really believe this type of headless architecture will promote a couple things. It will let your teams make lighter and more frequent deployments on the front end, and that will lead to just a lot of different innovation. If you look at the speed of change, the pace of change, especially if you look at the web and how much is changing in the areas around progressive web apps and so on, you need to be able to experiment and try out things on the front end at a pace that is a lot faster than a lot of the things on the back end, in which case you want to be able to empower your teams to make those changes without having to go redeploy the whole set of systems, especially if you do have one of those monoliths, as James talked about, then you're not going to be able to let your teams adapt and try things out as you go forward. So the other thing we noticed is that a lot of teams, a lot of retailers spend a lot of time learning a lot about what their customer actually wants and what the customer actually needs. And that knowledge is gained through just constant user testing and multivariate testing. And typically, if you are looking to re-platform or rip and replace part of your system, you tend to throw out a bunch of the front end with it, and a lot of that knowledge just gets lost, and you have to go spend the time rediscovering everything that you learned over the last couple of years. So our goal is to let you retain some of that knowledge by moving to a headless architecture, so that all the hard things that you had to go learn through various lessons, you don't have to actually toss that out if you do switch out part of your overall ecosystem. So that's where we're going in terms of just continuous iteration and just future proofing, which takes us to our first discussion point. So these sections, we have a couple of areas where James and I get to ask each other a bunch of questions. We just love to pick each other's brains on just these various topics. And we encourage you to actually add in a bunch of questions into the Q&A section as well. So James, I'm going to start off with really agility and how the content part of the equation tends to measure agility. As part of our sales cycles and a lot of our joint discussions, both our teams talk a lot about agility, but we also tend to measure them in different ways because we're addressing different parts of the equation. So how does that look like for you and your team?
So great question. I think this one's relatively straightforward to answer. I think there are two ways to look at this. The first is just how quickly can you create a piece of content? And by that, I mean sort of going from the point of planning and concepting that content, creating the media and the copy, combining that content together into some sort of content module, and then putting that into a campaign and getting that deployed into all of your various touch points and channels. For some of our very complex customers, when they first came to us, they had 2 to 4 week cycles for that. So you can imagine if the point of inception for a piece of content to getting it out is as long as 3 or 4 weeks, quite often that content never saw the light of day because the context would change, the weather would change, things would happen. So it was really a very kind of waterfall, non-agile sort of process to do that, and the net result of that was it was extremely sort of slow to get content out there. And in this day and age, that just doesn't really work. I think the other measure of it, Drew, is content reuse. So how well you take that single piece of content and get it into all the various parts of your experience without having to do any additional work. And I think that's the other sort of side to the real benefit of headless, is because you've decoupled presentation from the actual content itself, you can focus on the content, get that done in a day or two, sometimes for our customers in less than an hour, and then get that out into everywhere that needs to go seamlessly without having to do any additional effort at all. So it completely transforms the way in which some of our customer teams can do this.
Okay, so in that case, measuring lead time, the amount of time it takes from initial conception of content to it showing up in all the various touch points, as well as just making sure you don't do unnecessary work by trying to leverage any content that already exists across various touch points and various campaigns as well.
Yeah, very much so.
That makes sense. Question 2. We always love to hear about customer examples, customer stories, and impact of rolling out, impact on their agility and really a lot of their business metrics afterwards, based on rolling out a headless CMS. So how does that look like from a lot of your customers when kind of a before and after snapshot?
Yeah, I mean, it goes a little bit back to that lead time discussion we just had, Drew. So there's certainly a part of it which is just the time it takes to go from ideation to live. I think there are some more emotional benefits though, and I was reading some feedback from one of our customers, Sweaty Betty, who provides yoga gear, a bit like Lululemon, been a customer of ours for 6 or 7 years. They've just properly implemented dynamic content, the headless CMS part of the platform, and some of them said, it's sort of transformational. Other customers have said, I can go home in the evening. This is kind of serious stuff. If you're sitting there as a team and you're working to midnight because you just got terrible tools, it impacts morale, it impacts family life, it impacts everything, and in fact I think leads to really low quality outcomes. So it's about taking all this friction out of the system and putting teams back in control as well of what's quite a complex process. And I think there's huge benefit to that in terms of quality, the collaborative nature of the work, and the actual benefit in terms of user experience that's more compelling and more targeted.
I appreciate that human element to it. I think that's one of the things we tend to forget is, yeah, if we have the right tools and processes in place, then yeah, you don't have to be up in the middle of the night getting new content out. You trust the system, you trust the process,
Yeah.
and it just works.
Very well.
And on our end, we pivot now to kind of a question to both. I'm going to ask myself, like, how does a decoupled front end, a headless front end measure agility? And James, you touched on this early on around really what we call lead time. And in our case, we're not measuring. Amplience is measuring the lead time for content getting out to production. At the front end side, we measure really lead time of amount of time it takes for new experiences. In this case, a lot of times code that drives that experience to be deployed to customers. And we focus on, because our product is, making sure we enable digital teams, technical teams to do more deployments. One thing that we cite a lot is a study by a group called DORA around elite performing teams versus low performing teams. And one thing that they cite here is, elite teams tend to deploy code more frequently, deploy UX changes more frequently, and their lead time is 2,556 times more faster, which is really the time it takes from going, checking in your code to getting it out there. And so headless is a way to make sure you can hit an elite performing team by looking at lead time, because you're just looking at deploying just the UX code instead of the full monolithic stack code. And that's how we're providing kind of tools and product and process towards moving towards front end agility there. So that's our goal. We want our customers to kind of deploy on demand, make sure their customers see, the changes in lead time as low as possible. Ideally, that should be less than an hour. If you do hit a snag and see like some sort of failure, restoring services should be under an hour, and the change failure rate itself should be super low if you are aiming to be, on par with some of the lead technical teams out there. What we do see, similar to your customer examples, James, is when we see customers kind of start using our system, they do deploy a lot more frequently, and they're looking at 5 times more frequent deployments than monoliths, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of what that could be for a lot of these teams. We ideally would like to see them to get to like multiple deployments per day, but there's a lot of also process and kind of team level areas where we can still work on here, as opposed to just purely the tools and technology. So that's kind of the agility section that we're covering off there. We're going to pivot now into considerations for front end for headless, for content and commerce, of which we've been talking about really how headless architecture isn't really new. James, you and I have been in this industry for a while, and I myself have built various kind of commerce-led experiences using GSPs and so on, and they've been around for a while, even in a headless state. You could have a separate deployed storefront, which various commerce vendors have supported from the start. The last couple of years, we've seen a rise in web CMS and DXPs being the head on top of commerce engines, which still count as a headless architecture. But recently, we've been seeing a shift to more what the model that James, that you talked about, where it's a bunch of different touch points, custom front ends, talking to APIs backed by a bunch of different microservices, including commerce and content ones. So again, we're seeing a different variation of headless than the ones we've seen in the past, which leads us to a bunch of discussion points around, what challenges have we seen in the past around headless, and then what's kind of the path forward there. So James, you coming from the content side of things for many years, how often do you see kind of web CMS and DXPs be or custom front-end position as the head? And is that kind of is that changing over the last couple months or last year or so?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been been the default for the last sort of 10, 15 years. And of course, there's a lot of legacy platforms out there that have been designed this way. I think the challenge is that we're seeing our customers sort of begin to sort of react to and think about things from a fresh perspective, and particularly headless, are really just, there are a lot of great sort of functionalities in these platforms. Don't get me wrong, they're very powerful. There's 20 plus years of development that's gone into some of these frameworks, particularly on the DXP and web CMS side. But the challenge is that they are, very much difficult to change and very expensive to integrate. So the total cost of ownership problem is really beginning to hit customers hard. Particularly when they're trying to move quickly, it becomes a real challenge, because every time you want to launch in a new market or launch on a new device or create a new application type experience, you might have $1 million project to contend with. So we do see a lot of it. Increasingly, customers are moving to the headless paradigm, really to get away from that, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think when you mentioned before, how previously you'd be using a bunch of kind of really back-end technologies like JSPs and so on to drive the front end. I think we'll discuss a bit later on kind of build versus buy considerations, in which case,
Yeah,
a lot of the teams that are looking to do more modern front ends are trying to use more web-centric technologies that have really emerged in the last 2 or 3 years as the popular choice. And so right now they would if they would build it themselves, they would choose to go that route. So
I think.
I think driving a lot of that shift towards more of the custom front end or away from some of the larger and heavier weight systems that do cost potentially $1 million plus to do a extensive project.
Yeah, I mean, complexity is the enemy of agility, I would say, in this regard.
Yeah, so I think that kind of even answered the second question I had there for you, which is like the pros and cons of using like a web CMS as a front end. So I would guess you don't see as often now putting a web CMS in front of your system, and then that's kind of what we notice is, we do have customers who consider that option, but realize, because either the technology or the preference of various teams, they'd rather go with something a bit more lighter weight or more in the sense of something they feel more in control of. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. This always amazes me, this one, because quite often you go to all the hassle of buying a beautiful microservices cloud and sort of headless ecom platform, and then you sort of saddle it with this sort of old school albatross that sort of negates all of those benefits. So you're back into an upgrade cycle and all those other complexities. So there is a bit of this going on for sure, and I think in some cases for good reason. But increasingly, I think it's part of that overall shift to headless, and we're seeing less and less of it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So if you are, building out a bunch of microservices or adopting a bunch of microservice-centric platforms on the back end, and you're doing that because of agility, but you put in something in front of it that is going to be a bit of a bottleneck, then yeah, you are essentially invalidating some of your benefits there.
Exactly. It doesn't seem much point to me, but there you go.
Last question for you. What challenges do you see when rolling out headless? You've done obviously many projects across a lot of very esteemed retailers. Is there any common thread you see between those?
Yeah, I think there are some challenges, and it's important to be aware of them. The paradigm is different. The way in which you need to think about customer experience production is different because content is separated from experience. So, to some extent, and I think this is the major blocker we've come up against, I think it's hard for teams that have spent so long in a very sort of unified content management experience where they're in the page changing a widget, which is kind of content and presentation all at once, to then sort of step back from that and start to think about content more universally and experience more specifically and contextually. And that separation just requires a sort of a change in the way you think about how you approach the problem. I think the net result of that is for some teams, they find that separation is a little bit hard to get their heads around to begin with. And I think it's true that some headless systems, not Amplience, I'm very keen for everyone to be aware of, don't have very good practitioner tools. They're very much focused on enabling developers to integrate content into their applications and do that very quickly and sort of manage through a pretty database-like content entry form without any preview, without any planning tools and scheduling tools. I think the key thing is to address those practitioner pain points, which is really what we've been doing at Amplience. Make it much simpler for the marketers, merchandisers, and everybody involved in the content production process to really get their jobs done quickly and easily without having to worry about the headlessness of it. You just get all the benefits without seeing the joins, and I think that's the key for me, is that the whole system needs to work for everybody in that system.
Good, that makes sense. And it sounds like a lot of times you really need to touch and feel the tools to really get a sense of, does this work for my organization? And that is a key way of evaluating, which systems to adopt and so on.
Yeah, very much so. How about from your perspective on that one, Drew?
Yeah. Thanks. So from our perspective, I think the challenges we see with headless is basically at this point, cool. I've built out or selected a bunch of kind of microservice and API friendly platforms. Where do I start to build ahead? I think we've discussed a bit of, I could stick a web CMS in front of it, but a lot of teams will start to veer towards, I want to build my own kind of custom front end, which definitely appreciate a lot of teams want to do that. But I think as we get into looking at various teams, a lot of them will need a bit of a boost to kind of adopt really the best front-end technologies quickly. And so what we tend to cite, and what we've seen a lot of cycles with working with various retailers, is the teams can and want to learn the next generation web technologies like progressive web apps, which makes a lot of sense. You might as well use the cutting edge technologies that will be here for several years. But as you go through that, these are new technologies, new platforms. These are now kind of web-based tools around Node and JavaScript and server-side rendering and so on, which case then you need to learn how to build and maintain your own custom hosting environments and DevOps practices, which, you're going back to a world where before you're used to using cloud providers, SaaS providers. Now you have to go back to, okay, I got to figure out how to run this myself, which, is another challenge to take on. As we expect in the future, and James, as you talked about, we're going to see a lot of more touch points in the future, which generally means you're going to be maintaining a lot of different separate code bases and have to synchronize them. You have to explore newer future touch points like voice and so on, or kind of examples you've cited across cars and kind of cruise ships and so on. And then you have to deal with, how do I maintain these duplicate integrations to all the various microservices on the back end. So our goal is to make sure we can collapse a bunch of this so that you're not running into these complexities that will slow you down 3 or 4 years from now. By moving towards a consolidated way to look at sharing code amongst your front-end technologies, which kind of brings us to our next topic. What we'll try to get through shortly, just based on time, is really just building or buying the front-end on headless commerce and content. So last discussion points. James, when you're looking at giving recommendation to your customers and really be consultative with them, when they're evaluating kind of a build or buy decision around headless, what criteria do you tend to recommend, or what do you recommend for them to focus on?
I think the number one thing is to look really hard internally at their teams and look at just what they're trying to achieve. If this is a strategic project that is going to manage customer experience across multiple touch points, then my recommendation is always go and evaluate the vendor community that can solve the problem in the way that you've just described, because I think it's one of these problems that is emerging. It's something that teams don't really know until they get to it, how challenging it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that the big thing that we see is that there are a lot of these projects, React-based projects, Vue-based projects going on that suddenly hit the buffers at about 3 to 6 months in, because mm-hmm. all of a sudden you've got to deal with a massive range of complex kind of challenges around routing content and, mm-hmm. Maintaining consistency and internationalizing things, all these things that suddenly are non-trivial. And if you don't have experience in solving those before as a dev team, and let's face it, very few of them do, then I think you're much better off de-risking your project from the start and buying into not just the technology, but it's the know-how and the access to knowledge and experience that a vendor like yourselves brings to this.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. A lot of the complexities don't emerge until you start really trying to operate the combined set of technologies in the headless architecture, which case then you're kind of already in a sunk cost fallacy of like, I should just push through and try to continue with this.
Exactly.
And that's hard to get in front of. So the last set of questions are really around the strengths of a build approach and a buy approach. And James, I'm happy to kind of run through this section, but I don't know if you want to add anything around, hey, what you've seen in terms of customers who have built versus bought, and what strengths and criteria they appreciate out of either approach.
Yeah, I think the key thing for me is particularly when you look at what we were discussing just now, and you were articulating so nicely, which is if you can have a single code base to manage your experience across desktop and mobile and the other applications, which could be, let's face it, in-store clienteling or a warehouse app, whatever it happens to be. If you can do that, then your world is substantially simpler and you're far more agile. And that's difficult to do. You might be able to build a PWA on your own based on some open source frameworks. It may not be as performant, however, but to then extend that across all those other channels, I think is the real secret sauce and the genius that you guys have, because it completely changes the cost and return on investment equation. So I think the strengths of the buy approach are, when you think about your front strategically, then you should really go and consider investing in a platform that's going to deliver the kind of benefits that you guys can bring.
Yeah, and you brought it up there. I think one of the hidden things around here is just total cost of ownership, and really you don't really get that sense at the start. Which is really why we're trying to promote our front end as a service approach, where we want to have a single unified front-end experience on top of your headless content and commerce systems. When we want to strike the balance of why teams want to build in the first place versus why teams would buy, in which case then a lot of the build teams want to get to a flexible environment. They want to feel like they have the equivalent to a custom solution if they were to go build it themselves, but have a sense of this is future-proof if new things emerge on the web, or there's new backend changes, or there's changes in my organization. There's a sense of future-proof so that we can still balance out a lot of those strengths of the build versus buy approach there. So that's what we're trying to get to is, hey, this is a very valid option now where instead of going fully custom, you could look at adopting really a platform as a service to drive your front end as an emerging trend on top of the headless commerce and content. And really, we do that by providing a really scalable runtime, what we call an application literally network, built on a bunch of serverless technologies. So as you scale up for Black Friday or peak trading season, we don't want your team to feel the stress of, okay, what happens now? How do we scale up this brand new modern architecture and modern front-end technologies, and how do we make sure we don't hammer our content APIs too hard during high traffic periods? We take care of that for you so that your teams can focus on innovation as opposed to just running systems at scale. And we also want to provide development teams. Here's a single set of SDKs and starting points so that you can get started quicker, and that we can just try to change that TCO equation a little bit when you're looking at front-end experiences across multiple touch points and not just one single mobile PWA, for example. And finally, for us, integration is important, integration architecture, especially if you look at the trend towards more and more APIs and more microservices, and making sure you have something that is API friendly from the start is key to getting something up and running out the door, but also just really also future-proof in case you need to expand the amount of integration you have in the future across all those touch points. So that's really where we are now. James, thank you very much for all those discussion points and all those wonderful questions. We are open to a bunch of questions. We have time with Ashley. So Ashley, I don't know if you have anything you want to throw our way before we close out the session.
Yes, so we have time for 2 more questions. So one of the questions is, what are live examples of various types of headless deployment? Commerce-led, content-led, and API first?
That's a solid question. So yeah, where should we start with that one, James?
Why don't you pick a few and I'll pick a few.
Yeah, so I would say the majority of e-commerce sites out there are commerce-led, and I think that's because that's just the way it's been traditionally built. So for the most part, I would say at this point, as we try to track how many are headless or not, I would say a large percentage of them are just still in the commerce-led approach. What I've worked on in the last 4 to 5 years was more around the experience-led approach, where you would stick typically a larger DXP or web CMS in front, and that I think was popular in specific verticals or larger organizations that wanted to have the marketing agility benefit of having something fairly pre-integrated with all the various marketing tools. And in which case, I think that a lot of my examples were around that we worked on were around telco companies, or ones that had fairly extensive and large backend systems. And which case it needed, and it didn't matter if you stuck just the same kind of heavyweight system in front of it, and that's where the experience-led systems actually tended to do quite well. Is if you just had such an incredibly complex backend that it didn't really matter if you put a lightweight one in front, you were still looking at an agility problem. So we could look at a bunch of various telco providers that we worked on the past couple of years, I think, across various companies that have deployed that model.
Yeah, that's a good list. I would, just to look at it slightly the other way. So our headless content platform into commerce, sort of owning the glass, if you like, being the head, is sort of the dominant paradigm still for us. But what's happening is we're increasingly being drawn into apps, which become another head, and other applications. So good example, folks, is Crate & Barrel. If you go to Crate & Barrel site, it's a .NET commerce application that they've built themselves over many years. It's very functional, does all sorts of great things. Amplience drives all of the content in that experience, and not only drives it into the website, there's a separate mobile site, and there is also an app which has just gone live as well. It doesn't, unfortunately, use your framework. We should talk to them about that. But it's a more traditional native app that they've kind of gone down the iOS route. So, but we are driving content into that application in a completely headless way. So I think that's a very typical, by the way, implementation pattern for Amplience, because it sort of deals with the challenge of driving content into the storefront experience, but also enables us to push that across lots of different touch points. So in the UK, I would include the likes of Liberty, really good example of a very rich shopping experience with tons of content. I mean, that's a very small team working in a really agile way, driving content into that site. Works beautifully across a sort of more responsive type application front end, and then we've got lots of app examples across all of our.
Yeah, and our most recent kind of API-led or really headless example has been in the UK, anyways, with Debenhams.
Yes.
We recently did that shift where we rolled out a brand new front end on top of their existing set of systems, of which we're seeing a pretty big change in the lead time of how long it takes to get code into production for the front end, and really that's a pretty big difference. And in which case, we have a bunch of previous case studies and videos of that, but yeah, something that we'll be talking a bit more about the future, hopefully, or future webinars of how we've looked at agility and lead time from that perspective in the UK.
Yeah, and you're just so everyone's clear, because it's a great example, Drew. You're driving the PWA, the mobile experience, right? But also now the desktop experience.
Yep. They were one of our early launches of front-end service, where it's a progressive web app across all screen sizes, and then with that single experience layer now, now we're seeing teams being able to quickly deploy changes out there and get to a new level of agility, which is great for an organization that really is super interested in becoming more agile overall.
Absolutely, yeah. And they did that by chopping the head off WebSphere, didn't they? So they didn't have to kind of rip and replace everything. They just API'd the existing infrastructure, and then you use you guys on the front end. So great example.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the final question is a little bit quicker. Beyond content and commerce thought leaders, who else is leading the way in headless?
Who else is leading the way? In terms of, is the question concerned with types of businesses? So I think telco in particular has been a very early adopter of this technology. I think you alluded to some examples there, Drew. There's a lot going on in that space that makes sense, because obviously you want to take payments on handsets, and you want to use RFID to do micropayments in all sorts of different ways as you interact with the real world. So I think that's a great one. We're seeing quite a lot in travel. Obviously the Carnival Cruises one is a good example. But increasingly, I think you're going to get into a situation where you will no longer, thankfully, have to check in. Just do it on your phone, right? And wave your phone at things to buy them. I mean, all that sort of stuff. I think there are headless use cases appearing everywhere. Alexa's a good example. There's lots of Internet of Things examples. We're working with Blue Air, which is a air purification brand owned by Unilever. And there are lots of examples of where we're going to drive content into the devices themselves, so that you can access content on there, but also through the various different ways you can interact with those devices. There's just an explosion, I think, of this stuff everywhere. So this headless future, with this kind of many-headed hydra of user experiences to manage is absolutely real, and increasingly so.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for questions, but if anyone does have any additional questions, feel free to contact us at discovery@amplience.com or hello@mobify.com.